Hello, Theology and Science learning community. It's Dave Opterbeck, and we are going to kick off now some discussion of historical perspectives on theology and science. And I think this is a really useful thing an important thing to get into for a couple of reasons. One is it helps us put a little bit of context into the current sort of claim that there ought to be a conflict between theology and science. And we'll see a little bit of where some of that claim of a conflict might come from. And the second is because some of the themes about theology and science historically in Christian thought that we'll see are things that we need to keep coming back to. And in some cases, I think reevaluating and seeing to what extent we might need to develop or modify them. But in other cases, I also think in a way of perhaps redeveloping or recapturing some things that maybe have been a little bit set aside. So we're going to talk a little bit about ancient views of the universe, about early and later Christian thought, about the two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, and about some kinds and sources potentially of modern conflict. One way to kick this off is to think for yourself for a moment, maybe even pause the video for a moment and ask yourself, why does the heart pump blood? Why does the heart pump blood? Now, if you thought about this a little, I'm sure you could think of a number of different layers of explanation. You might say that the heart pumps blood because the circulation of blood through the body is necessary to keep the body alive. You might say that the heart pumps blood because it's made up of muscle cells that respond to a rhythmic electrical impulse that causes those cells to expand and contract. You might say that the heart pumps blood because it is formed along with those cells that expand and contract into a shape that receives the blood from the arteries and it serves as the pump through which those things go. You might say that the heart pumps blood because God designed the human body that way. You might say that there's a certain kind of importance to biological life. There are multiple different levels or layers of explanation, and all of them in some ways are invoking a question of purpose or of teleology. And for the modern natural sciences, that concept of purpose or teleology is really a problematic one. The modern natural sciences, as science, really purport to exclude broader questions of teleology. And that might be an important limitation methodologically. In some ways, it might be a limitation that is hindering in some ways. But when we're talking about philosophy and theology, we are going to be invoking some broader ideas about purpose and teleology, as well as some broader questions about structure. We, in a biological sense, perhaps could begin to reduce the heart down to the kinds of muscle cells that are in a heart. But we really aren't explaining what a heart is if all we're talking about is a particular kind of muscle cell. And so we're always getting to different levels of explanation that relate to different, more holistic kinds of systems. And that's part of what some of the discussion of history and philosophy we'll be talking about will get at. It's often said that the scientific revolution began in the 17th century, maybe a little bit earlier, and that before that there really was no conception of science. And that kind of statement, in one sense, is partly accurate because there was not a modern conception of science, but in another sense, it's not accurate because there certainly were observational activities of the natural world that resulted in practical applications that were the beginnings of what we might call aspects of the natural sciences. And certainly all the cultures of the ancient world were interested in natural phenomenon. So if we look, for example, in the ancient Near East, and that would include Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, they were quite interested in and adept at aspects of agriculture, of writing, which is maybe partly an art, partly a science, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and all of these things were to differing degrees developed in those cultures. Now, of course, in these ancient cultures, the gods or magic were entwined with the physical world. There certainly was not any concept of a natural apart from the divine, and so notions of causality and purpose were closely entwined. But there were also observational things that were done and that had practical applications, for example, building the pyramids. We can also look at other ancient cultures, for example, the cultures of India and the Indus Valley. Again, engineering, astronomy, mathematics, linguistics, medicine, and the intertwining of the divine with the physical world, as well as the intertwining of philosophical speculation with what we would today call natural sciences. And then in the Greek world. So the ancient Greeks were very interested and methodical in understanding the natural world with astronomy and engineering and mathematics, especially geometry, anatomy, zoology, geography, and other things. We want to take some time to look into the ancient Greek ways of looking at the universe right now, because they are going to have some really important impact on early Christian views of the universe. We're going to come back later in our learning community when we look at the question of interpreting the Bible at some more in depth at some of the ancient Near Eastern views and how they impact on the Hebrew scriptures and on the New Testament. But for this sort of theological and philosophical discussion, let's take a few moments to look at some aspects of Greek thought. One of the important questions for the ancient Greeks, which is an enduring philosophical question, an ancient philosophical question that is still with us and still really endures, is how does the universal relate to the particular? How does the universal relate to the particular? And what we mean by this is, let's take something like a person. So we have here a picture that is a famous Renaissance painting of Plato. And so Plato is an individual person, or you are an individual person. I am an individual person. And that is a particular. We are each a particular person. But all of us would probably agree that we are human. And the human in this example is the universal. And we would even say that we have some kind of universal human nature, or at least that we have some kind of universally applicable human rights. Let's say a right to free speech, a right to free exercise of religion, other civil rights in relation, right of privacy, for example. And we might want to say, particularly in our Western context, that these are universal human rights. So there is something about us, we would say, that is shared by all of us and that is universal to this type of humans, or that is universal to this category of human. And at the same time, we are each a particular human being. Well, how do we say that? What does that mean? Now, in modern philosophy, there continues to be a lot of debate about this, and much of it along the lines of categories that were set in these ancient debates. And for some in the natural sciences, really this category of the universal is finally a kind of meaningless category, that really in scientific terms, all we have is the particular. Everything else is kind of metaphysical speculation. Now, I want to suggest that this is one of the key errors, or one of the key places on the side of the natural sciences where there are kind of insurmountable problems with excluding philosophy and theology from a holistic explanation, unless we want to lose the sense of something like a humanness that defines us all and that relates to things like human rights, although there are other philosophers and scholars who would disagree with me. But this was a core question for the Greeks. And in particular, an aspect of this question, and it's one I'm kind of alluding to with talking about human rights, is what, for the Greeks, is what defines excellence. And for the term for the Greeks is arete. What defines excellence? So how can I say this particular person, Socrates, or Plato, is an excellent person, an excellent philosopher? How can I say this particular person, let's use an extreme example, Hitler, is not an excellent person, in fact, is a bad person? Maybe a little more kind of down to earth. What's an excellent meal? When you and maybe just, again, take a little time and pause the video and think to yourself, when I think of an excellent meal, what do I think of? Now, I can say for me, when I think of an excellent meal, there are certainly components of how I think the meal tastes, what sort of foods might be involved. I'm also going to think about how the meal looks, how the food is presented. I will also consider the company that's part of the meal, the fellowship that's part of the meal. There are many different aspects and levels to it. And if I'm making that kind of comparison, and even more so when I'm making that comparison to an excellent person, well, how am I doing that? Is it just a totally contingent thing? I had a certain experience that's kind of just randomly part of my personal history of what I thought was an enjoyable meal, and that's what I call excellent. But somebody else might call something completely different excellent, and it's really an utterly subjective thing. And maybe we'd say the same thing about persons. We sort of have just evolved in such a way, and society has evolved in such a way that we think of, Mother Teresa as excellent and Hitler as horrible. Maybe so, but maybe not. And maybe this idea of excellence does refer to something higher than the particular, something more universal than the particular. At least that was the question the Greeks asked. Now for Plato, and I'm going to talk about this in ways that we're going through very quickly or way oversimplified, don't reflect every aspect of the thought of all the thinkers that we're going to be talking about, don't reflect every aspect of rival schools of thought from some of the thinkers we'll be talking about, but I still think are kind of generally fair generalizations and are good background for us to have. So for Plato, the way of thinking about this is to posit a perfect eternal realm of what he called the forms. The forms, or ideas, the realm of the forms or ideas, is abstract, it's timeless, it's absolute, and it's more real than the physical world. A particular physical thing participates, and this is a key philosophical term in this discussion, participates in the essence of the forms. But each particular thing is an embodiment that, to some degree or another, is participating in that realm of the forms and in its excellence. So here's an example. I mean, let's imagine these fuzzy clouds and so on are the realm of the forms. Now, in doing this, we're already getting outside of what Plato actually thought, because we're picturing physical clouds and so on. But it's the realm of the ideal. It's a non-physical realm. But in this realm, let's say, is the form of, the ideal of wineness, what it is to be an excellent, perfect glass of wine. And in the world of the particular, the material world that we inhabit, there are particular glasses of wine. Now, to some degree or another, the particular glass of wine is participating in this realm of the form, the ideal of wineness. Maybe it's a sense of luxuriousness. Maybe it's a sense of depth. Maybe it's a red wine. It's a sense of complexity and plumminess and spice and things like that. And to the extent there is a depth of participation in the form of wineness, there is a relatively excellent or less excellent particular glass of wine. And it also enables us to identify what is here as wine and a type of wine, and not something else, not just grape juice or not beer or not water. So wine might be a little too specific when we're talking about Plato and the forms, but hopefully it's an example of how you can have a concept, a mental concept of the perfect, and that's a universal, and how the particular may or may not participate in that. So that's kind of Plato's way of thinking through this in real simplistic discussion. And let's talk now about Aristotle. And we're focusing on Plato and Aristotle because these are, as we'll see, important figures in the history of Christian thought. So Aristotle is concerned with the same question of the relation of the universal and the particular, and Aristotle is also interested in questions of causality. So Aristotle is going to take some of Plato's thought and is going to significantly modify it. And what we're really interested in for now is Aristotle's idea of causality. And Aristotle's idea of causality is in many ways different from modern conceptions of causality. And so Aristotle conceives of 4 causes: the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. The material cause is the matter from which a thing is composed. The formal cause is the arrangement, appearance, or shape or form of a thing. The efficient cause is the action that causes a change in a thing. And the final cause is the end or purpose of a thing. Now, a way to envision this that we often use is thinking of a statue. So here's a picture of a marble statue, I believe it's of Apollo, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So the material cause is marble. The matter it's made of is marble. The formal cause is a man, or more specifically, Apollo. The efficient cause is the sculptor chipping away at the block of marble until the sculptor has the image of Apollo. And the final cause is to inspire awe or to inspire devotion in worshipers of Apollo and or in the civic sort of cult that the statue might have been part of, and or simply in the beauty of the statue. Now, something to notice about this is that it involves, when we talk about formal, a notion like Plato's realm of the forms. So the sculptor has in his mind the ideal of what he wants to draw forth from this block of marble. And this, depending on the sculptor's skill, he may, more or less have achieved an excellent representation of the form in the sculptor's mind. And the final cause involves teleology and purpose. The sculpture exists for some purposes, and those purposes are connected with the form that the sculptor has in his mind. Now, modern natural science has really done away with formal causes and final causes, and has reduced the examination of nature to the material cause and the efficient cause. Now, modern natural science doesn't speak in these terms, but effectively this is what over time has happened, and we'll talk in a bit about some reasons why that might be so. Now, this could be a useful thing. It does allow for a kind of discrete rigor that a broader reflection that includes formal and final causes doesn't completely allow. But on the other hand, if we were actually looking at something like the sculpture of Apollo, we really wouldn't be describing what the thing is. If all we said is it's a block of marble that shows the marks of someone chipping away at it. We really wouldn't be describing it if we're not talking about the formal and final causes, and that's really what Aristotle was concerned about. So now let's talk a bit about how these Platonic and Aristotelian ideas influence Christian thought, and in particular influence Christian thought about nature or creation. And what I'm showing you now is a very roughed out timeline of Christian history or church history. Again, all of these things, there's so much more that we could put into it, but we need to kind of strip it down a little bit so that it's manageable for us. So we can look at the apostolic era as the first century. I have CE, Common Era, we could say first century AD. But this is the period in which Jesus is born and lives, and Jesus is crucified, and for Christian belief that Jesus rises again. And it's the period in which the documents of the New Testament are composed. Now, we don't have to get here into different theories about how and when the various documents of the New Testament were composed, but broadly speaking, they're mostly composed in the mid to the end of the first century. Maybe some are composed a little bit in the early second century. And it's the time that the original apostles who walked with Jesus, and then subsequently also the apostle Paul, were alive. So we call that the apostolic period. And then from about the end of the first century into about the later 8th century, we call that period the patristic period. And we can also call it sort of the classical period of Christian thought. So during this patristic period, the church fathers, mostly religious leaders, bishops, some monks, some others, who are engaging in debates about the meaning of the experience of the first followers of Jesus and the meaning of the documents that comprise the New Testament, as well as the documents that comprise the Hebrew Scriptures, as well as other documents that didn't eventually make it into what we call the canon of the New Testament. Now, again, we don't really have time to go into the questions of canon formation and all of that, but it's a period of lots of debate, lots of discussion, and consideration particularly of two really core issues, which are closely related to each other. And those issues are how Christians speak of God as Trinity and how Christians speak of Jesus Christ. And the problem is raised because Christianity, the first followers of Jesus, come out of, initially are deeply connected with Judaism, which is a faith that is defined by its belief in the one God. And Christianity claims to be in continuity with being a monotheistic faith, of believing in only one God who indeed is creator of everything. But we speak of, and from very early on, Christianity spoke of, and the New Testament documents in varying ways spoke of Jesus as somehow being divine, or at least somehow being connected to the divine. And so if we are going to speak of Jesus as divine, a human being as divine, how are we still speaking of one God? This is indeed the argument of Jewish believers contrary to Christian theology. It's the argument of Muslim believers contrary to Christian theology, that we are really not monotheists, that we really are positing two or three gods, because we're talking about the Father and the Son, and then we also are talking about the Holy Spirit. So how can we do this? And really, in the first 4 centuries of the church, there's robust debate about how we do this and how we speak of this and how we say that Jesus was both divine and human. And in relation to that, then, how we speak of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as three persons, but as one essence, as still only one God. And a couple of markers, and we won't get into detail about this, but the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE and the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE were instances in which councils of the church gathered together to try and define some of these ideas. And these councils are informed by some of the great thinkers and theologians of the patristic era. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this. There is lots of great scholarship today about the diversity that was before these councils and that even continued after these councils. There's lots of discussion about the role of the Emperor Constantine in calling the Council of Nicaea and a whole bunch of other things. And we don't need to get into that in any depth, but we do need to know that some of the key thinkers that we are going to be talking about are developing their ideas about Trinity and Christology in this period. And in doing that, they are also talking about the relationship between God and creation, because some of the people that they are debating with have very different views. And some of the people they're debating with have views that really get into some of the Greek mystery religions, or that are really tied closely to some ideas of Plato in a movement that was called Neoplatonism. And many of these early church fathers are interacting very closely with Neoplatonism and the thought of Plato. Now, 1054 BC I've marked out here as the Great Schism. This is when the Latin or Western Church centered in Rome formally splits off from the Eastern Church centered in Constantinople. Many, many things go into that, but there is a kind of divergence of intellectual and theological life. And this next period we talk about is really primarily the Latin or Western Church. There's many other interesting things that could be said about the Eastern or Byzantine Church and churches after this period, but our focus is really going to be on thinkers that represent this scholastic period, who are from the Latin or Western Church. Now, this is going to encompass a lot of time and different movements. It encompasses the medieval period, early, middle, and late medieval period. It encompasses the Renaissance period, and it encompasses even up into the early modern period, because some scholars for the Roman Catholic Church don't see the kind of end of the scholastic period until the 18th century. So we have this interaction with medieval thought, with Renaissance thought, and we'll talk about that a bit. Within this also, of course, we have the Protestant Reformation. It's traditionally marked out as beginning in 1517, when Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. We will talk again a little bit more about what that means, but I want you to get a feel for the stretches of history and the different interactions. And this scholastic period in Roman Catholic thought is interacting heavily with Aristotle. In the thought of Thomas Aquinas, who we will talk about, it is trying to integrate the thought of Aristotle. And in the thought of some of the scholastic thinkers who opposed Aquinas, was actually reacting in some ways against Aristotle while still taking Aristotle as a touchstone. And the Protestant Reformation, in its own ways, is interacting against scholasticism, and thereby also in some ways interacting against or with Aristotle. So let's talk about this period of early Christian thought and Platonism. One kind of innovation of some of the Christian church fathers in this patristic period is to relocate Plato's realm of the forms into the divine ideas, or in a sense, ideas in the mind of God. So and they saw, Plato as kind of having an incomplete comprehension of the truth, even though Plato was a pagan. They suggested Plato was onto the right thing. He just didn't identify that what he was really getting towards was not some abstract realm, but the living God. And a lot of this thought built on the Christology and the discussion of creation in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the Logos, this logic or principle or language of creation. Now, we have to be careful when we're setting this up this way, because as modern thinkers, we hear ideas in the mind of God, and we start to imagine God as a sort of like a person like us with different parts that would include a brain and a mind. And that is most certainly not how the church fathers would have thought about it. They would have thought about it in relation to their understanding of divine simplicity, and we were going to come back to that concept in a week or two. So all of this language is analogical, but what they're really saying is Plato was onto something. There is a universal ideal, but that ideal is God. And so we might say then, if we're looking at, say, this concept of wine and wineness, is that, yes, there is an ideal conception, a universal of what a beautiful gift of a glass of wine is about, and a meal, and so on. And where that is in the life of the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. This is an old representation of the Trinity. And so it is from God that we get the goodness of something like a beautiful glass of wine. And to the extent we have something that is really corrupted and in fact evil, we wouldn't speak, of course, of a glass of wine this way, but to the extent we have something that is really corrupted, it's because it's somehow fallen short of the ideal, and that something has gone wrong between what it is now and what it is in God's mind as ideal and what it's meant to be. Now, I mentioned this notion that the early church fathers, and by the way, Maximus the Confessor is one example of some of these early thinkers who thought really deeply about the ideal and about the Logos and so on. And Maximus, by the way, did that in the context of debates during his time about exactly how to define the natures of Jesus Christ, the human nature and the divine nature and their relation. He's called the Confessor because he was accused of heresy in the way that he was framing these two natures of Christ and their relation. And the church leaders where he was at the time, in fact, tortured him really terribly. And he refused to recant the views that he held. And it was only later in his life that he was sort of vindicated as being on the, quote-unquote orthodox side. That just shows you a little bit about the difficulty of all this. It makes you wonder, of course, also about a period when people would torture people over really fine distinctions that almost nobody understands. And obviously there was a lot more about identity and politics and other things behind all that. But coming back to this idea of simplicity, this idea of divine simplicity, we will come back to more in a couple of weeks. But the notion is God is without parts. Everything in creation is composed of parts that relate to the universal and the ideal. So, again, think of you or I as human beings. We have certain things that are inherent to us, as all human beings do, without which we really couldn't be called human beings. Maybe one of those, which the church fathers would have recognized, as a capacity to reason. Now, in a thing in creation, I'm looking at on my desk here at my water bottle. It has no capacity to reason whatsoever. There's no possible way in which it could ever be called human. Now, there are other parts of us as human beings that are accidental or incidental. So I play the guitar. Well, not every human being plays the guitar. You don't have to play the guitar to be a human being. I could lose the ability to play the guitar. I could get into an accident that injures my hands, or even an accident that injures my brain and my ability to process the signals to play guitar. It wouldn't make me not a human being. I just would lose that part of myself. It would be sad, but I'd still be a human being. And this is a distinction that they wanted to draw between God and creatures. God isn't like that. God, all at once, wholly and completely, is love and justice and goodness and not all knowledge and all power and all of those things. And none of those things could even conceivably be lost from God. He's those things all at once and simply. So the notion of ideas in the mind of God is simply an analogical thing. And in fact, we ought to say, and in fact, it leads to the very Platonic kind of idea that the material creation participates in God. Just like the particular things for Plato would participate in the world of the forms. Now, if you're listening to this and you're not familiar with these ideas, you might think, whoa, that sounds off. I mean, are you saying that created things in the world, that water bottle on your desk, are you saying that that thing is partly divine? Are you saying God is part water bottle? No. We say the material creation participates in God, but is distinct from God, or the church fathers would say this. Material creation participates in God, but is distinct from God. So participation is this philosophical concept moved into a theological concept of how the particular thing relates to the universal. And in this case, how anything in creation relates to the goodness and the wisdom and the power and the will of God. Okay, so we have now talked very quickly and very inadequately about this patristic period. Let's talk equally quickly and equally inadequately about this scholastic period and the rediscovery of Aristotle. Now, we talk about the rediscovery of Aristotle because in the West, and to a large extent also in the East, we're talking the European East and West, during the late Roman Empire and the collapse of the Roman Empire and then into the medieval era, there was some preservation of works of Plato, particularly through the Neoplatonists and through the Church Fathers' interactions with the Neoplatonists. But the works of Aristotle had largely been lost. There are many different reasons for this. One thing you have to remember about these times is that there was not movable type, so printing was very difficult. Most books were copied by hand. They were extremely expensive and extremely rare. So the average person didn't, there wasn't libraries and access to manuscripts. In the ancient world, in the sort of late classical period, there was a famous library in the North African city of Alexandria, which contained lots of manuscripts, and that library declined and was destroyed, and so many manuscripts were actually lost during that period. And so it's just simply the case that the works of Aristotle were not really known in the Latin West. But some of the works of Aristotle in manuscripts, in rare manuscripts, were preserved. Many of them were preserved in the East, and in the medieval period started to come to light through Islamic scholars. And there was a period that scholars of religion called the Islamic Golden Age, when thinkers such as Avicenna, Ibn Sina, were interacting between Islamic thought and Aristotle. And through that, the works of Aristotle began to become more available to Latin Christians in the West. And we take Thomas Aquinas as kind of the high mark of the Latin Christian West interacting with the works of Aristotle. And if you know anything about this period in history and even contemporary Roman Catholic theology, Thomas Aquinas is really venerated as one of the great thinkers in the Christian tradition. And it wasn't always so in many ways. Aquinas was a teacher at the University of Paris. We called this era scholastic because these people were teaching and writing in what were really the origins of the Western university. And Aquinas' works in many ways were quite controversial. He was following methods that were well established and familiars of commentating on other scholars' earlier works and of kind of bringing his explanations to bear on it. But in the way he was integrating Aristotle, some thought it went too far. And in fact, there were periods when some of Aquinas' works were actually banned until Aquinas himself was rehabilitated. But what Aquinas said is that Aristotle's four causes can be applied to everything in creation. And he emphasized that Aristotle's notion of the formal cause is important because it relates to a thing's powers and capacities, and that the final cause is important because it relates to a thing's purposes and to the values that relate to those purposes. And all of these things for Aquinas relate to the idea of the virtues or virtue. It relates to the idea of how we speak of God, but it also relates to the idea of how we speak of goodness or lack of goodness in human beings and in human endeavors. Now, in adapting Aristotle's four causes, Aquinas went further into thinking about how God, as Christian theology conceives of God, interacts with creation or relates to creation. And this is one of the huge questions, enduring questions for Christian theology and natural science. And the key terms for Aquinas are the terms primary and secondary causality. So Aquinas said God is the primary cause. God is being itself. God is the source of causality, the cause of causality. And as final cause, God is the end towards which everything moves. Creatures operate in the domain of secondary causality. And in this domain of secondary causality, creatures have their own causal integrity. Creatures, including human creatures, are not merely entirely determined or deterministic, but they are given by God because of their participation in God's being. Notice that Aquinas doesn't completely abandon the Platonic categories, but he expands them with the categories of Aristotle. That's part of Aquinas' genius. But in participating in God's being, since God is primary cause and the source of causality itself, creatures have their own kind of secondary causality that is encompassed within God's primary causality. And this allows Aquinas to deal with really tricky subjects in Christian theology, like the doctrine of providence, in relation to the question of human freedom. So if God is the creator of all and sustainer of all things, and if God is all powerful, and if God is all knowing, and if nothing happens except that which is known by God, and if nothing happens outside of God's will, then how can we speak at all of a mouse having some freedom to sort of make mouse-like decisions about where to dig its hole and eat its cheese? Never mind a human being having a kind of freedom that's a sort of moral freedom. And the way Aquinas tried to address this is through this idea of secondary causality. And this remains a really important conceptual framework for thinking about the relationship between theology and science relating to causality today. And there are some, and I would include myself in this realm, who really draw on a kind of neo-Aristotelian sort of schema and find real value in Thomas's thinking. There are others who think it doesn't really hold up. But this is part of what we call the Aristotelian synthesis in Aquinas' thought. Now, all of these pre-modern Christian thinkers that we have been talking about, from the patristic era up through Aquinas, saw creation as a sign, or in a sense, as a sacrament. Now, we need to be a little bit careful here. The Roman Catholic Church, from which Augustine and Aquinas are part of, have their specifically defined set of sacraments within the church. So we're not talking here about a churchly sacrament like baptism or the Eucharist. But we are talking about the relationship of the sign and the signified. If you know anything about theory of languages, you'll know a little bit about this. So, let me write my name here. Dave. This set of letters calls to mind, and as I speak it, embodies a set of sounds. And because of our cultural context, because of our historical context, because of all the contingencies of how language culturally develops, that set of sounds signifies to you a name. And as I am speaking it in the context of the group that might be listening to this, it is signifying me, Dave. Now, the sign itself is basically arbitrary, but it has a bigger meaning that points outside of and beyond itself to some set of concepts or other realities. And so creation, as something that participates in God's own life, that embodies the perfections of God in the way that is appropriate to something created, that in Aquinas' Aristotelian terms has the formal cause of God's conception of what it is and ought to be, and has the final cause of being drawn into the life of God, is pointing away from itself towards God himself. And so therefore, in that sense, there's a sacramental aspect to creation. It isn't merely something that can be reduced to its elements or components. It points to something bigger beyond itself. And it isn't something that is just mechanistic. It's something that is dynamic and lively and participates in the very life of God. Now, of course, these pre-modern Christian thinkers had to deal with the reality of evil, or the notion of evil. In fact, most of them thought evil was not something ontologically real in itself. We will get to that in a few weeks. But they had to deal with the problem of evil, and they had to deal with imperfections in the created world. And this is where Christian doctrines of fall and sin and things like that come into play. And they have their own complexities that we will talk about a month from now. But we do have this basic concept of something bigger about creation. And really, this is something I think it's very fair to say that modern science can't have. And it's something even that I think it's fair to say, is missing in our kind of popular Christian spirituality in many ways. Even in our kind of contemporary Christian debates about the meaning of, the meaning of evolution, or whether some kind of creationism must be true, or other things that we really lose the overall truth of the sacramental nature of creation. Now, how did we get there? How did we get to the place where we're even beginning to have that problem? All of that will be the subject of the next video.